You're listening to Members of the Jury, the show that takes you straight into the trenches of justice, where the passion, players, and consequences are real. Each episode, we examine current events happening in the system. From the battles in courtrooms to the streets demanding reform, we bring those stories here to you, the members of the jury, because we aren't afraid to take it to the box.
What's up, members of the jury? And as always, happy Freedom Friday. I am so excited to bring this episode to you all because I think it is going to hit on such an important faction within the criminal justice system that to those who aren't in the criminal justice system probably have never heard about and won't understand the importance. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Lindsay and Erica, who will discuss the importance and significance of mitigation, what that is, how that plays a role in criminal cases, and why it's frankly needed and needs to be uplifted to be more included in our system. So without further ado, Erica and Lindsay, please take a second and introduce yourselves to the members of the jury.
I'm Lindsay Bendel. I am a licensed clinical social worker. So I have my master's degree in social work from Denver. And I started off as a Colorado public defender for 2 years. And now I do private practice mitigation and forensic social work.
I'm Erica White. I'm a former prosecutor turned private defense attorney / immigration. So I do a lot of immigration cases, and I represent some clients both in the criminal court system and the immigration court system as well.
Well, I'm really appreciative of both of you guys taking the time to join me and to make mitigation more of an awareness in our system. And hopefully people, after listening to this episode, will see the benefits of it and, quite frankly, give more effort into mitigation. Because I can tell you as a public defender in the system, not every lawyer, unfortunately, is willing to do the grunt work that is collecting mitigation. And to hear that both of you have, perspectives from the defense side, from the prosecution side, and from the clinical social work side, I really feel like this is going to be such a fruitful conversation, since all of the parties that are normally involved in a criminal case essentially get some kind of perspective throughout this episode. So that's super enlightful to see. So let me start off by asking you, Erica, can you just quickly, for the members of the jury, just give a background as to what is mitigation and how does that even come into play once someone is charged with a crime?
Sure. So mitigation would be anything that you would want really the prosecutor or the judge, or in some cases the jury, if you're in a state where the jury can take into consideration the penalty and decide the penalty, or like in California where you have on death penalty cases, you'll have a sentencing, basically trial. And it's anything that you want that those people, those members of your audience, to take into consideration regarding your client. Anything that kind of either explains their behavior or mitigate why they committed the crime or what was going on in their life at the time. Just kind of demystifying people.
Now, I always think that struggles, and quite frankly, I think it happens a lot in the legal field where you're trying to get certain understandings of words, but really the word itself is the best way to define it. And so I think, right, mitigating is really just trying to give, I don't want to say like a justification, because I think that's not what mitigation is trying to do. It's really trying to, like, I think you did an excellent point of highlighting, like, to me, the way that I like to explain it to my clients when I say, hey, go out there and collect mitigation, and they're like, well, what's that? The way that I best like to describe it is like, look, the prosecution only know you from the four corners of this police report. That is what they are judging your entire existence off of. What is it about your life, or what are things that are going on in your life that would be a better definition of who you are? Do you think that's a better take on trying to explain mitigation, Lindsay?
I like to say that I humanize criminal defendants, right? We are more than our worst mistake, and we all have a story to tell. My whole spiel when I go to like a party and they're like, "What do you do?" The way I say it is nobody wakes up in the morning, stretches out their arms, and says, "I think I'm going to do something really heinous today." Usually something brings them to that moment. And that's what mitigation is. It's explaining what was going on the day, the weeks, the months, the years leading up to the incident, because we know that that doesn't happen in a vacuum.
You know, something you said right there that I absolutely love is the notion of trying to humanize your client. Because in my humble opinion, as a public defender's office, the criminal justice system is designed to dehumanize individuals who are charged with a crime. You know, they're booked into custody and given a booking number, then they have a case filed against them, and then they have a case number. And as they go throughout the criminal justice system, they're always asked, "What's your case number? What's your booking number?" You know, Erica, could you tap into your prosecutor's hat and talk about that? You know, is that something that you think is by design in the system to dehumanize individuals when charged with crimes?
Yeah, I think it is. And, you know, before the podcast, before we started recording, we were talking about like caseloads. And the thing is, like, you really do become a number in a long line of people and like a huge pile of cases on a person's desk. And they're really just flipping through a report, giving it maybe 15 minutes of a look through, and then they're deciding what they're going to offer you and what is your fate. And like it's so dehumanizing. And I've had times too where like prosecutors won't even look at like mitigation reports or consider mitigation. And you're right, it is just a very dehumanizing system. There's not time, the judge doesn't want to hear your whole life story. And like it's you're like you're in and out, you're in these crowded courtrooms. It's exactly like you said.
Well, so what I want to hear from both of you is essentially how you came to an entity. Basically, from my understanding, your organization is solely focusing on this notion of mitigation. Lindsay, I'll start with you first because, you know, I think that for me, I can have a little bit better logical track to go from public defender to social worker to this area. But just give us a little bit of a background as how to you made those different leaps from starting as a public defender to switching to the licensed clinical worker to then focusing specifically on this.
Yeah. And to clarify, I was a public defender social worker. So, yep, I was never an attorney. I was actually one of the first 4 adult social workers in the entire state of Colorado. We were almost like a pilot program to see if we were going to be worth it. And there's more than double now. So we were definitely worth it. So that's always good to hear. So the story of how Mitigation Mentor kind of came to be is, I left the public defender's office after being overwhelmed from caseloads, and especially as a mitigation specialist, I only, we have now abolished the death penalty in Colorado, but we were pretty close even when I was working. So we rarely had death penalty. So when a case comes to the mitigation specialist, they are really tough cases. And I was handling like 30 of them at once, first degree felonies, second degree. I got really overwhelmed. I burnt out and I went into private practice. And I was doing private practice mitigation all across the country. I was doing federal work, I was doing county work, I was doing state work, you name it, I was doing it. And it turns out that spending all of your time in prison is really depressing. So again, I kind of felt this like really deep burnout of like, there's so many people that need our services and there's only so many of me. So I kind of went back to the drawing board and I asked myself, what could I do to make more of me, so that way I'm not the only one having to handle all these cases, and B, to make sure that more clients are getting mitigation because they deserve it. And that's kind of how I dreamt up Mitigation Mentor. And, the first iteration of Mitigation Mentor is to teach fellow clinicians, so licensed clinical social workers, licensed professional counselors, things like that, how to do non-capital mitigation. So we can add more, experienced professionals, licensed professionals to do this work. So that way clients have a better chance of obtaining a mitigation specialist. And we have more people in the workforce doing the work and bringing it attention to it. I reached out to Erica, or Erica reached out to me. We have the same hairdresser. Shout out Amy. And yes, anyone in Denver, Amy is your girl.
I love that.
He connected us and we just like really hit it off. Erica told me her story. I told her mine, and she's like, I want in, let's do this. And so we've kind of been inseparable ever since.
Wow, that's so amazing. And I'm super excited. And Erica, I'm going to come to you in a second. But, Lindsay, a couple of things that you said that I just really, that resonate with me is one, the burnout and really the burnout due to, what's common in our space is the secondary trauma. And obviously we aren't the ones who put ourselves in that positions, but because from public defenders or the defense side of things, we take that oath of counselor at law very seriously, and that extends to way more than just advocating for them in the courtroom. And we really become these individuals' counselors. And so because it is in our nature to get that mitigation, to try to humanize them, it is not uncommon for individuals within the criminal justice system, especially on the defense side, to feel that secondary trauma. And I'm glad that you clarified with regards to being the social worker at the public defender's office, but even still, highlighting the fact that it's more than just the actual attorneys at the public defender's office who suffer from low budgets, lack of resources, understaffing. It is the public defender's office as a whole. And when everyone is experiencing burnout, that's when we have problems, because it is literally us and only us who are there for over 80% of the criminal justice system, since nationally, that's how many individuals are represented by indigent defense. So I think that you highlighted a lot of great points in your experiences that led you to the road that you are currently on. So Erica, how about you? I would love to hear how you ultimately made, if I heard your biography, you're correct, the switch from prosecutor to defense attorney to this mitigation specialist, which, as we noted, from a prosecutor standpoint, seeing someone as numbers to all the way other end of the spectrum to, really collecting the mitigation, how does that happen?
I mean, in law school, I started off I interned both in a defense attorney's office, and that defense attorney has been a longtime mentor to me, Tarek Shaki. Shout out to him. He's in California, he's in LA. And I interned with him. And then I also interned at the LADA's office. And it was really actually at the LADA's office that it really surprised me how sympathetic I was to people charged with crimes. Particularly, I worked as an intern in the family violence unit, and I was dealing with a lot of child homicide cases. And I have to say, that vicarious trauma is real on both sides, because I was all the interns were super traumatized after working on these horrible, baby death cases. But during that time, I was listening to a lot of jail phone calls, mothers who were charged with abuse resulting in serious bodily injury or death of their child. And I became really sympathetic listening to these women. And it really tore me up, because I would listen to women on the phone with their mothers or family members, and they would be like, I knew I was feeling overwhelmed and I should have called you. Or their mothers were like, I knew something was wrong and I should have been there. And what I started to see was a lot of post-traumatic or not post-traumatic, postpartum depression in these women who were committing these horrible acts. I mean, I worked on cases where children had broken ribs, they died, they had huge hematomas on the side of their head, really horrific injuries. And I would listen to these really distraught mothers who were so repentant and regretful of their actions, and listen to them they, jail phone calls are recorded, but people are pretty honest on them and they act like they're not recorded sometimes. And I would listen to them talk about like the postpartum depression that they were suffering leading up to it, or the situation that they were in. A lot of them were young, single mothers, about like between, I would say, like 20 and 25, with no support system. And they were usually women of color, either African American, Black, or Hispanic. And I remember going to a prosecutor that I was under her supervision and saying, like, I feel so bad for this defendant. And her saying, like, don't think about that. Think about the dead child. And it's like, I feel bad for the dead child. I feel bad for the mother. But what didn't ever sit right with me or make sense to me as a prosecutor was I always felt we were intervening at the wrong moment, right? Like the chance to intervene has come and gone. The harm has already been done. It doesn't matter how much punishment or jail time we put this person through, it's never going to prevent what happened. And jail is just a really ineffective deterrent to recidivism. I think that's like made very clear in literature that we have. And I never felt like that was going to prevent recidivism by just throwing somebody in jail. And there's frankly no bigger punishment than the loss of a child.
I think that also hits on a lot of excellent points because, you're totally preaching to the choir. And I would imagine Lindsay agreed with me with regards to, very little times does jail time actually cause the turnaround that people are hoping for. But, one of the things that you said that was most interesting to me, and again, what I try not to do on the show, just despite it coming from a public defender and defense point of view, is, I try my best to still be objective and fair and reasonable, because I think that that's always important. And I don't try to put prosecutors in a box, albeit if the shoe fits, I'll leave it at that. And so one of the things that you said that I don't dispute is that the trauma of criminal cases affect the attorneys on both sides, both prosecutors and defense. And I don't dispute that. What my question to you is whether or not you feel that it's accurate that, from my point of view, is that the longer a prosecutor is in the system and the longer they're exposed to their trauma from their point of view, the more hardened that the prosecutor becomes for them to see the accused as a number, and the less receptive they are to mitigation. I feel that I have more success with newer prosecutors who are still more open-minded.
I think two things really harden a prosecutor. Like, you are sitting with your client, and like I'm doing now, sitting with my client, hearing about their life story, their trauma, and everything like that. They also have sometimes a victim sitting there, and a victim crying on the phone, calling them multiple times a day, talking about how much they've been hurt or their loss. And so we both, on both sides, we only hear one side. And like, then we have to like go in and represent each side and kind of come to this agreement. And that can be very difficult. So I think sometimes prosecutors are very driven by their interaction with the victims. And just like, we create these bonds with our clients, they're also creating bonds with their victims. Like, I worked for a DA who married his victim. Like, he ended up marrying her. Or like they become friends. They go to, like, I had one prosecutor who, she had a case where the mother was like murdered, and she ended up going to the daughter's quinceañera. So like, you get attached on both sides for sure. So I think that's one thing that hardens a prosecutor and can make them really dig in, is if they feel a great attachment to the victim. And then the second thing is, yes, like when I was looking at like 1,000 DUIs a month, and everybody is like just picking up these cases, and like it's the same set of facts over and over again. Like, person was speeding, person crashed, person rolled their car, person blew a .12. And like, I'm like, you're just another like statistic to me. I don't see you as different from anybody else. And like, that's where mitigation can make a lot of difference, right? And also, like, in mitigation with those victim cases, if you can humanize it to the prosecutor, and then the prosecutor can take it back to the victim and be like, look, this was everything that was going on. That's also another thing. Because like in Colorado, we have really strong Victim Rights Act, and the victim gets to put their input on the offer. Ultimately, it was at my discretion as a prosecutor, but 90% of the time I did what the victim wanted.
And I think too, like, to add to that, something that you said at the beginning was, like, we have to zealously advocate both sides, right? And I think sometimes mitigation can be the thing that brings it all together. Like in this last case that we worked, Erica, like, I think I literally put the term, which I've never done before, is like, let's talk about the elephant in the room, right? This is someone who's reoffended a few times. And like, I am going to be remiss. And also, I should back up too. I don't know if we actually talked about like what goes into mitigation. So I basically write people's biographies, right? That's like kind of what I do.
Yeah. So that's where I was going to follow up. I was going to say that I think we've done a fantastic job as to giving the background as to what mitigation is, and I think that that's just an excellent little like segue is to, and I'll follow up with you, Lindsay. Is like, okay, so now that we have kind of an understanding as to like what mitigation is, what purpose it's playing, I'll start back up with you, Lindsay. Like, where does someone start? Like mitigation start?
Where does it start? In the womb. I mean, yes.
No, seriously though.
Yeah. So, I mean, my mitigation starts by, first speaking with the attorney, kind of like, why are you calling me? Like, what's your goal? What's kind of your argument, and how is my mitigation going to fit into that argument? And then what I do is I contact the client and I do a super in-depth biopsychosocial assessment, biological, psychological, social assessment. I want to know all the big pieces of their life. Where did they grow up? Did they meet all their milestones as a child? Did they finish school? Were there gangs in their neighborhood? Was there lead in their water? Have they ever been married? Have they ever lost a child? Has there been trauma in their life? I want to get into it. My assessment is 16 pages long. So I'm spending a ton of time with these people. And, as a clinician, it's really important for me to build that rapport so that they feel comfortable opening up to me. And that's really the biggest piece is, sometimes I'll go the first time and I really won't ask a ton. I'll just let them ask me questions and I will just sit around and be a human with them. I had one client who was younger in Philly, and he would come and bring cards and he taught me how to play Hold'em. And we'd always start off our session with playing one round of Hold'em, and then we would dive into it. And he was so much more relaxed and open. So the big first part is that biopsychosocial assessment. And then from that assessment, I walk away from that with pretty much all of the mitigating themes in my head, right? Like, child grew up without a father. Child grew up in a neighborhood where everyone was involved in gangs. Child never finished the 8th grade. All these types of mitigating themes. And then when I'm done with the biopsychosocial, I will do the mitigation investigation. So I'll start calling anyone who could have been involved, coaches, parents, family members, friends, anyone who could be involved and who could be helpful for the case. And then after I get their interviews to really back up the information that I've gotten from the client, then I connect all of these themes with peer-reviewed research. So it's not just me saying, look, this guy got involved in a gang that ended up in a shootout because he came from a home with no dad in a poor neighborhood where the only way he could survive was to get jumped in. And here's the research that backs that up. I'm not just saying this. And then I put it in a big report. Sometimes we do a PowerPoint, sometimes we do a video. There's, a multitude of ways that you can do mitigation. And it allows us to also really be creative in something, that in a profession that's been like very much the same for all of eternity.
Is there a certain component when collecting mitigation that you found to be more difficult than other aspects of collecting mitigation, or a certain area where you see a lot of individuals who have been accused with the crimes give pushback?
I mean, mitigation is all difficult, right? Like that's the whole point of it. And that's why I think like it's so hard to do like back to back. Like, when I burned out in my private practice, I was doing the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act cases out of DC, and I was spending all my time in federal prisons. And I have a client that I got out of prison on an LWOP, and we just sat. It was the federal prison it was the BOP in West Virginia. It was the coldest I've ever been in my life. They had the place at like 28 degrees, and they gave me 2 like 6-hour shifts. So all I had was 12 hours to get all the information I needed from my client. So it's like I couldn't eat a snack. I couldn't. So like first I'm already in like this kind of like dysregulated space. And the kid grew up right in DC during the crack epidemic. Like when you think about, I'm no longer a Kanye West supporter as a Jewish woman, but right when you think about crack music, yeah. When you think about crack music, that's that crack music. That's the story of his life down to a T. He was born addicted to heroin. His mom shot up and OD'd in front of him. Like his dad died from an overdose. Like his entire life from the womb was trauma. And so I'm sitting in this terrible, cold as hell federal prison talking about the worst things that can happen to a human being. And then I have to go back and write about it. And it's hard to do that. And there are some clients that aren't as open just because they don't. Something I've been talking a lot about on my Instagram that I've been like collaborating with like therapists of color is really trying to like destigmatize mental health in the Black community, because for a lot of our clients are men of color, right? Because we live in a very racist society. And so, communities of color, for great reason, do not trust mental health professionals, doctors, like they don't trust medical professionals, and they shouldn't, because we've been terrible to them throughout history. And now as the clinical community works towards being more well-rounded, and we have more therapists of color and people that our community of color can work with, we have to work so hard to destigmatize and demystify the mental health process, right? And that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to struggle sometimes. You don't have to just pack it all in and go to work the next day. So when I have clients that have never talked about it ever in their life, they're just like, why do I need you? This is not something that affected me. And it's like, well, it has affected you. You've just never had words for it.
And also you see the unfortunate individual who had been in and out of the system and had never had any type of mitigation collected, which then has resulted in this now, really backbreaking type of scenario where, and fortunately they do come across an individual who now wants to backtrack and collect all that mitigation to kind of explain the pathway. But, you might have missed that opportunity because now they've just been accustomed to the system and its broken nature, right?
Yeah. And, people want to slap antisocial, diagnoses and stigmas onto our clients. Well, how do people become antisocial? When you lock them in a cage full of other people that have committed crimes, that's how you make someone antisocial, right? Like you're creating this beast, and then you're the one that's trying to make them pay for it. And a great example of this is Parkland, right? Like I'm actually from that area, and I used to, interestingly enough, my synagogue was small. So for high holidays, we had synagogue in the auditorium of Stoneman Douglas, where the shooting took place. So I'm very connected to that school and that community. And, he escaped the death penalty because my friends who are on that team were able to prove that he is worth living. He is a human being, and he is worth being alive. And the system failed him. and he was, he has fetal alcohol syndrome. He was born into a terrible life. The system never intervened appropriately. And then the system came back and said, we want to kill you because we didn't help you.
No, that I agreed. I thought I paid a lot of attention to that because that was, in my opinion, one of the first, as you talked about earlier, Erica, certain states have different phases of trial and then the criminal one. And that was really the first, I think, modern day, quite frankly, for blunt purposes, mitigation trial. Like that was, they had already pled. It was only whether or not he was going to receive the death penalty. And it was only about the mitigation. And you could see, and that's why I thought that this episode was so important, because you could see the amount of pushback that received. And I'm on social media. I made some TikToks, and, I don't really like to speak of jurors or the victims' parents out of their names, because again, I want to leave that space, because as victims, especially the parents of victims, like they deserve that space to grieve and to feel that their world has crumbled, because it has. But so many of them came out and said, like, why does this country have the death penalty if this case doesn't get it? To which I posed, like, well, one, this country shouldn't have the death penalty. and two, it's like, at the end of the day, then they also didn't respect ultimately the verdict that came from the jury, who bought into the mitigation. So I think that that's a great point. And honestly, Erica, I want to transfer to you for a second, because I think, quite frankly, one of the potential elephants in the room with regards to this episode is when we're talking about collecting mitigation, and I would love to hear it from your guys' business's perspective from mitigation mentors, to see if you fall within the same kind of dynamic as that. Is that as public defenders and criminal defense attorneys, the majority of our clients, as you had alluded to, Lindsay, are people of color, but they're also poor. And what's fascinating to me is how it's affluent and generally communities where it's predominantly white people, mitigation is all but welcomed. And in fact, we see people go down the pathway of mitigation before any kind of criminality is introduced or charges filed. In your guys' business practice, do you see that spillover, that basically, you're working with a very certain demographic of people to collect that mitigation that have been are being prosecuted by the system, as opposed to being awarded that opportunity to present the mitigation before one is basically introduced into the jaws of the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I mean, Lindsay and I were discussing like the Murdoch murders and like the amount of privilege that person had beforehand, like both him and his son, like Alex Murdoch, and then his son Paul, who was charged with like the DUI.
Yeah, never booked into custody.
Yeah.
If I never booked into custody, and that's just my point. Like, this guy is something, albeit he'll be in charge, but there was obviously mitigation accounted for that led to him not being booked and processed.
Yeah, like his dad being able to sit down with like the victims beforehand, and yeah, just like the amount of professional courtesy that was awarded is insane. It reminds me so much of like an old Chappelle skit. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but like you'll have to Google it, where like Chappelle is basically charged, but he is treated like a white person would be charged, and then there's a white guy who's charged and he's treated like a black person would be charged. And it's just hilarious, and it really holds the test of time, unfortunately, that is just how it goes. And the reality is, if you have money and you have somebody who can pay for a private attorney who can spend all the time in the world, like there are some of my cases where I've spent 8 hours, like a whole day with just one client, or where I get to where I've driven and picked them up from their house or things like that, or, versus working in your system as a PD where you're crunched on time, or like Lindsay was saying, you're one of 4 mitigation specialists for the whole state. Like, that's insane. It is unfortunate that like the amount of time and effort that goes into gathering mitigation
And I also think to highlight just the power that mitigation can have, especially when it's heard and received. Something that was something that the judge said, and it was very subtle. And just to piggyback off the Murdochs, was like, obviously, he got his life sentences, but the judge said something to the effect of like, he might even believe that it wasn't quote unquote Alec who had committed these murders. It was the Alec who was, caught up in the drug uses and after taking 60 pills of opioids or whatever the allegation was. But it just showed you, like, it was like, look, that judge, and I honestly thought it was I liked how the judge was able to essentially separate those hats. And going back to Lindsay was saying is that, like, and albeit not necessarily, maybe Alec isn't the best example of this, but even two people convicted of murders, is that like they are more than the worst act that they commit. And I think that judge, despite the overwhelming evidence that this individual did it, saw that it wasn't this individual, let's say, at their best. The mitigation in this case didn't affect the sentence. It allowed that judge to, I think, humanize him in a moment. And from my position, anybody charged with a crime at least deserves that bottom line of humanization and to not be treated as just the numbers. So I thought that was a little special moment, and especially a good segue in leading up to this. So I think we've done a good job of covering what is mitigation, how mitigation is essentially collected. Erica, I wanted to follow up with you, essentially maybe from like a prosecution's point of view again. Are there cases where you feel mitigation, from a prosecutor's point of view, where mitigation isn't even on the table? Like, they have their facts, they have their evidence. By no means are they really worried about any mitigation.
I mean, it's so unfortunate. And I've had this come up to me in the past couple of months where, like, I had a prosecutor walk up to me and and I was like, can we move on this? Like, we're set for trial. And she was like, it does not matter any mitigation that you give me. I am not changing this offer. And
we've been striking out left and right lately. Like this past month, all the mitigation, like I worked over my vacation to get a report to her and they didn't even read it. They were like, nope.
Yeah. And they didn't tell us.
I cannot stand that. Like, as shitty as it is, at least tell me to my face you're not interested in the mitigation. But again, if the shoe fits, I'm not trying to be critical, but I cannot stand a prosecutor to say, like, get all this mitigation, because we'll go through the work, we'll do all the prep, and then we'll submit it, and it is as quickly disregarded as it was even looked at. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, Erica, but Lindsay, I just can't stand when that happens.
I mean, I can't stand it either. And it really took me by surprise, because when I was a prosecutor, there was just always times where I loved mitigation. I was like, give me a reason. Give me, let me put something in my notes to justify this to my chiefs or to the victim, or prevent any sort of blowback on me when I give you a really sweet deal. So I was really disappointed because, like, one prosecutor didn't even fucking tell me that he wasn't going to consider the mitigation. And Lindsay wrote this beautiful report. She spent all this time with the client. Client obviously is paying for private defense, private mitigation. That's not cheap. And then they were just like, within, I think, maybe 2 hours of me sending my email, they were just like, nah, we're not moving a day. We're not moving a day. And I'm like, oh my God. And that's just an unfortunate attitude. Like, obviously we're seeing a lot of different types of prosecutors being elected across the country. Like, you have, a very controversial prosecutor in LA, Garzon, who is big on like PR bonds and mitigation and things like that. You also have some like sheeps in wolf clothing who are like, I'm very liberal and I get it, go Bernie. And then they get elected and then they're like, same thing. They're falling asleep in your mitigation presentations. And
we have people like Krasner, right, who is trying to do better for the city. And now the state politicians are trying to oust him, even though he was democratically voted into his position. So I feel like they're sending quite a message that is like, we want the Black people in cages.
Well, you saw Shea Bowden get recalled in San Francisco too, and I just think that there's so many false fallacies that surround the criminal justice system that unfortunately I think that our clients receive the brute end. But I'm so glad to hear that there's organizations like yourselves. Obviously, I stand pride in what I do, and so I've been really fortunate to hear about these. I guess Erica, Lindsay, both, if you guys want to piggyback this, I guess, but so we've talked about why mitigation matter. Let me ask you, explain, ultimately, why does mitigation matter? Right? We talked at the beginning of the episode how it's not necessarily a justification for someone who may or may not have committed a crime, because I think it doesn't really matter whether or not someone is innocent or guilty. There's mitigation to be had. What's your guys' position as to why at the crux of it does it matter, and why should there be a space in the criminal justice system for mitigation?
I think what's really interesting about mitigation is that we can start tracking where we need to intervene and how we need to intervene before somebody even comes into our system. I think they're really good illustrations. Like when Lindsay writes about my client, I'm like, well, we could have intervened there, or social services should have intervened at that time in that child's life, or they should have been given, state funded therapy and things like that. And I, as a prosecutor, was always much more interested in how we can prevent crime rather than how we punish it. And also, we can start creating better alternative programs. And I don't think that we're not without progress. Like today, when I was in court and my client was taking a plea, the judge asked him if he had ever had a brain injury. Like TBI is real, and courts are recognizing, traumatic brain injuries as a cause of people's actions. We have veterans courts, we have substance abuse courts. Those are things that did not exist prior, but it all comes from this community recognition that there are things that affect people's behaviors, and we should take that into account, and maybe we should come up with an alternative program for them. And so I think mitigation has a really unique role in that it starts identifying it to the prosecutors. Like if we keep saying we consistently have clients with traumatic brain injuries, you should not be throwing somebody in jail because traumatic brain injury freaked out. Can we think of an alternative solution? And I think that's the really cool thing about humanizing somebody is we have to come to a realization that a one shoe doesn't fit all.
Yeah. And, to me, mitigation matters because everyone has a story to tell. It just goes back to, no one wakes up in the morning and says, I think I'm going to do something heinous. There's a lot of systemic failures along the way. And I think it's just so important to be able to fight for somebody with more than just what is on a police report and what is in the discovery, because people are so much more than a file.
Couldn't agree more. I want to give you guys an opportunity. I've heard I've gotten to learn a little bit about your business just by way of this podcast. And I've heard obviously that you've talked about you guys being based in Colorado, but, take a time, either one of you, to introduce really break down your business, where you're located, where you guys are practicing, how people can reach you, just give us the breakdown of what Mitigation Mentor is and how people can contact them.
So Mitigation Mentor is the first and only on-demand education program for forensic social work and mitigation. So we are creating a masterclass that's on demand, the first of its kind that, like I said, the first iteration will be for clinicians that are interested in diversifying their practice and be able, to to become involved in something that they're passionate about, like advocacy through the criminal justice system. To teach them these skills, they'll get a certificate of completion. And then, they can start taking on smaller cases. And then we're hoping, for the next iteration to maybe be something that we can license to like public defenders' offices and things like that to provide training. When I started, I was the first social worker. So I got a fact investigator training, and they were like, good luck. I hope that doesn't happen to any other mitigation specialist. So we're hoping to make, a second iteration of this that can be used for training in like office settings, things like that. We do consulting. We have a once monthly on the first Thursday of every month. We do a non-capital mitigation consultation hour. It's completely free for the community. All you have to do is sign up. Bring any questions you have about non-capital mitigation. Myself, our colleague Lindley Weber, who's based out of Washington, and Erica are all there to give advice and to talk through difficult non-capital mitigation cases. And then for me, I still do private practice on a much smaller scale. I actually live in Philly now, but I still do a lot of cases out of Colorado, and I operate nationwide since my license, I'm not like an attorney, so I'm not like tied to a state.
Okay, beautiful. Well, I think that's I love that, especially the idea of masterclass and really expanding the horizon as to what is mitigation, how many people know about it, what it entails, because I couldn't agree more. I mean, the amount of the field of mitigation just in my short 6 years as an attorney has expanded so much, and especially with each passing year, new data coming out, more opportunities to have mitigation received by way of legislations, mental health diversions, all these different opportunities that have been arising. I just think that that's super exciting to hear about, and I'm wishing you guys all the best. The way that we ended the podcast in each episode is asking our guests to explain the significance of taking matters to the box, whether that be in the courtroom or in the courtroom of public opinion. And so if you both would take a second and just explain the significance of taking mitigation matters to the box.
I mean, I think it's so significant when in all phases of like taking it to the box, right? Whether you're negotiating with the prosecutor, or you're going to a sentencing with the judge, or you're doing, a penalty phase if you're in one of those states like California. Mitigation is going to matter in pretty much every phase of your engagement. And I wish that juries were able to consider the penalty in cases in all states. Because they're not. And like, I think that they can come to see like your client as a human, as a person, the reasoning behind their actions or the cause behind their actions. But it does matter. And then from like a very personal space, one of the main reasons I became a prosecutor is because my mother was a victim of rape when I was about 11, and it was by her employer. And it was just an event that completely turned our lives upside down. I mean, she had to go to trial on it, and he was convicted, and she got such bad PTSD that she developed a form of schizophrenia and lost custody of me. So for me, like, there are a lot of times where I sit there and go like, he got out eventually. Like, and when he did, it sent her into a whole new level of like mental health decline. And so like, jail isn't forever. And what is going to happen to this person? How are they, how is their behavior really going to be corrected? And why would they ever do this? Why would they ever do this to my mom? And so like, I think mitigation can also matter to like victims. Why would you do this? Because I think that's a lot of victims' questions is like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
No, I think that's an excellent point. I think that's an excellent point. And to the point that we were talking about earlier, especially when victims, always, I think there's always going to be a space for them to opine as to the way that they feel about a case resolving. To that point, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that could potentially have a huge impact as to how they feel about it without, again, it's not of a justification, but just it's a pathway that can somehow make sense or explain how an individual got there. You know, it's to say, look, this individual was molested themselves as a child, and no, that's not a justification for them doing it, but it gives more, it makes more sense for that to be the background than for it not to be the background. And so I thought that was a really excellent point and something that I hadn't necessarily thought about. So I really appreciate that. How about you, Lindsay?
Everyone is more than their worst mistake, right? I mean, that's what it boils down to.
No, I love that. And I don't know if you're directly quoting him, but that's definitely a quote of one of my favorite individuals, in Brian Stevenson. I would highly encourage everyone to read the book or to see his movie. I think he does, from an attorney's point of view, he was one of the first attorneys that I experienced who really focused on mitigation as well as, factually disputing a case. So I thought that I love that quote and say it almost religiously in my negotiations. So I just wanted to, again, thank you both for giving me the time and giving the members of the jury your expertise and your knowledge. I would say I was happy to connect with Lindsay online. For those who would love to be a guest or know anybody who would like to be a guest, please reach out to me at lhursty at Members of the Jury Pod. You can find us on social media at either Members of the Jury or MOTJ Pod. We would love to hear from you. We would love to connect. We're continuously fighting for a better criminal justice system. And hopefully after this episode, we have that many more tools. So once again, thank you both.
Yeah. And we have an Instagram. It is at True Crime Social Worker.